All right, welcome everyone. I'm Jacob Frankham. I'm the superintendent of schools in Troy, and so glad to see so many people from Troy schools here, and a lot of names I don't know, but we wanted a lot of people here from Lincoln County. I know there's a lot of people from Flathead County, and we're really excited to be hosting this event as a school district, as a community. I'm also on the CASA board for Lincoln County, and so I wanted to turn some time over to Sean Carlin, who's the director of the CASA program in Lincoln County, and just give him a few minutes to introduce himself and what CASA is all about.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. Appreciate it very much. Just like to welcome everyone out tonight, especially Ashley. Thank you for joining us. Jake and I began speaking about Ashley, 6 months ago, but he's been dreaming about this for over a year, I think, ever since he read Ashley's book. We were actually hoping to get her here live, but I think COVID has put a damper on that, but we got the next best thing. So thank you for coming out. I've actually had the pleasure of hearing you, Ashley, speak in person. I believe it was at a national CASA conference in DC, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And she has an amazing story. I know we've been circulating the book throughout both Lincoln County and Flathead County, and a lot of you guys have had the chance to read her inspirational story. So thank you for that. For those of you that don't know much about CASA, just really quickly, we started a CASA program here in Lincoln County about 2 years ago, November 2018. That was at the request of the Montana Supreme Court and Judge Cuff, who wanted CASA to come in and start serving as guardian ad litems for children in the foster care system. CASA, for those of you that don't know, stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. And here in our judicial district, we serve as guardian ad litems for children that are in the foster care system. Those of you that have read Ashley's book know that she had a CASA in her life and the role that CASA played. And I think she'll probably talk a little bit about that. But basically the CASA is the eyes and the ears for the judge. What we do is I liken it to a Big Brother's program on steroids. We advocate for children's best interests. That is in the court system where we're writing court reports, in the school systems. We're advocating for their mental and physical health and honestly, just life in general. So here in Lincoln County, 2 years ago, we started, we had nothing. 2 years later, we have 15 CASAs in Eureka, Troy, West Kootenai, Libby. We have an advisory council now. We are a satellite program of the Flathead CASA program out of Kalispell that has over 100 CASAs. They've been going strong for about 20 plus years. And it is our goal to become our own 501c3 and go independent here within the next few years. Other than that, I look forward to tonight's story. If you guys want to know more about how you can support CASA, we have a Facebook page that is CASA for Kids of Lincoln and Flathead counties. Love you to like us. Our website is flatheadcasa.org. And you can also message me tonight if you want to get more information on how you can help. Basically, we need more CASAs. We need financial support. Basically, we're a nonprofit. We're running off grants and donations. So we need all the support we can get. We're going to be doing a Christmas drive here in the next month. And just in general, just spreading the word about abuse and neglect and how that impacts not only the kids, but the families in our community. So other than that, I'll turn it back to Jake and Ashley, and thank you so much and look forward to hearing tonight's presentation.
Thanks, Sean. I really appreciate it. I guess a little bit of background for me. I came across the book and found it just riveting, and it just opened up my eyes to the kids and the situations that they're dealing with. And so after I read the book, I devoured the second book. And then I reached out to Sean and said, hey, is there a CASA program? How can I help? I want to be more involved in this. So that's how we've kind of gone down this road in reaching out to Ashley. I'm so glad to host her. So Ashley was born into a single teen mother in 1985. And by the age of 3, she was living in Florida's foster care system, where she spent almost 10 years being shuffled between 14 homes, some quite abusive, and before being adopted from a children's home at the age of 12. So despite her ordeal, she excelled in school because she believed that, quote, my education was the only thing nobody could take from me, end quote. Early in her life, she felt compelled to advocate for herself and the other children she lived with, particularly in the abuse of foster homes. And ultimately, a CASA volunteer was assigned to her case, and Ashley's credits her CASA for helping her become the woman she is today. And in the early days, she thought her CASA Mary was just a well-mannered woman who checked on her progress. And behind the scenes, she became her champion. And it would be years before she realized that she had accomplished this on her behalf. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ashley and turn the time over to her.
Well, hello, friends. I'm so on yet. Is it ready? Okay.
Good.
Okay.
You're working.
I'm 95 on the inside. So I am unlike all of you teachers who have masterfully gained all of these new online skills. My truth is a little more slow and painful. That has not been my reality. So thank you so much for your patience. We also, because 2020, we had a little bit of a hiccup last night where Florida decided that we wanted to throw a little hurricane in the mix. So we got had a direct hit for a Category 1 hurricane last night. Tons of damage to my house. However, we still have internet and power. So here we are, ready to rock and roll. But if you do hear children screaming in the background in some capacity, or a dog or a cat, we've got holes in the ceiling. So we had to do a little moving around the house. So I'm not quite as secluded as I ordinarily would like to be for these events. So thank you so much for your flexibility and patience and your grace as you hear my children screaming, the dolls that they are. But it's truly a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm hoping that the next hour that we spend together to keep things really casual and conversational. I thought I was really slick. So I'm talking on my phone, but next to me here, I have my computer so I can utilize the chat function successfully. So please feel free as I'm talking. My life is an open book, so to speak. You see what I did there? Friends, that was hilarious. Everybody, pause your video, get your coffee, otherwise it's going to be a long night. So please utilize the chat function and ask me questions to the open forum privately. I'm really hoping to be more than just a story, but also a resource. And I think it's imperative that people who are serving in the helping professions or in education, child welfare, I've yet to meet anyone in these fields that's like, obviously I do it for that fat paycheck. So I know intimately that you are here because you want to make a difference, because you have an investment emotionally, functionally, fiscally, whatever. You have that investment in your community and the lives of young people around you. And I think that's so amazing because the world that I come from, I didn't know all this help existed. So it's so remarkable to now be an adult and have this new lens and this new perspective. But also it brings me tremendous joy to be able to display the gratitude that I didn't have the capacity to show when I was a young child, because I was caught in the foster care system and I was really in survival mode. It was so much trauma, so much change. I changed schools twice a year until the 7th grade. So all of this upheaval was occurring in my life and I didn't understand why. I didn't have people telling me what was going on. I wasn't allowed a voice. I wasn't an active participant in my own life. And what made things more frustrating was that many of the homes that I was in, they were very abusive. I was in foster care for almost 10 years. And during that time, I had 14 different placements. I later learned that more than 25% of my caregivers were or became convicted felons. Well, little bit of a licensing oversight there. Somebody's fingerprints slipped through the cracks there. But needless to say, I was definitely not in the most ideal of circumstances, but none of this is new to you. You all work with children, whether you're a CASA, whether you're an educator, whether you're a volunteer, whether you're a parent, you know a child who has been victim of abuse, neglect, or that cycle of poverty, lack of access to education, lack of access to resources. And you do so much to try to make a difference. So if there's only one takeaway that you have from all of this, I hope that you will remember how amazingly critical and important your roles are. Because even though you feel like perhaps you're not making a difference, or if you have one more kid roll their eyes one more time, or ignore you, or do something destructive, or just be plain annoying, please know that you are making a bigger impact than you ever could realize. So I admittedly was not always the polished young woman you see before you. I was horrific as a teenager, and I had a lot of stuff that I was just working through, and I wasn't grateful, I wasn't gracious. But now I get to spend my entire adult life thanking those who went out on a limb for me, who enacted these very small acts of kindness that had a ripple effect that I never could have imagined was possible. But luckily, there were some adults in my life who saw something more substantial in me than I ever could have imagined myself. So, as you are faced with some of the most frustrating elements of your jobs or your volunteerism, please know that you are doing work that is not easy, but you might very well be that one person, that one key element to resiliency that completely changes a child's life. I'm already getting questions in the chat in the private function, which is great. So I'll do a little back and forth. Actually, one of the questions is one of the most poignant questions that I regularly get. And the question is, do I still have contact with my little brother? So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with my story specifically, but it's chronicled in my first book, which is called Three Little Words. And the relationship that I share with my birth family is one that I get asked a lot. So just a moment ago, I mentioned that the work that you do is life or death. And I don't say that casually. My brother was one of the more traditional statistics of a child who comes from a lot of dysfunction, a lot of foster care moves, a lot of uncertainty. And about 3 years ago, our lives just went in very different directions. We channeled our pain and experiences in very different ways. And about 3 years ago, I'm very sorry to say, he overdosed and died. And he was a part of the opioid and heroin epidemic that is continuing to sweep our nation and destroy families. And so I'm trying not to cry like 5 minutes into this. But his story is a very personal and constant reminder of the impact you have an opportunity to make. Because of a few caring adults that I had in my life, not necessarily grand systemic change, not conferences and trainings and necessarily best practice, evidence, all of these things. It was these small acts of kindness that helped switch those little lights for me. And as a result, I get to be here sharing this evening with you while my brother will never see the end of his 20s. That's the impact that you make. You help children understand and see that they are not their circumstances. They are not the environment that they were born into. They can be so much more than what the rest of society expects of them. There are ample ways for you to make a difference in the life of a child, and not just a foster child. Foster care is definitely the world that I come from, but the pendulum in child welfare has changed. So when I came into foster care, it was in the, late 80s, almost 90s, and it was at the height of the crack epidemic. So there were a lot of removals that were happening, no questions asked. When I was placed in care, there were very few preventative services. So pre-foster care services. Children were being removed for the smallest of slights. So this created a very significant influx of the amount of children who were in foster care. Today, they often try to implement family preservation opportunities. And admittedly, a system that supports a child's family of origin would have been extremely helpful in my case. Interestingly, my birth mother was 16 years old, living in a group home in foster care herself when she got pregnant with me. She later turned to people who gave her food, shelter, housing, support. Unfortunately, those people were drug dealers and pimps and people who did not progress her life in positive ways. And so she really struggled to figure out how to be a parent, how to be a part of the world in a successful way. A year before I was born, her mother died. So my biological grandmother. And from what I understand, my biological grandmother had had 5 children before her early 20s and died in her early 30s, a year before I was born. My grandfather had a 7th grade education. So my birth mother, as part of that cycle of abuse and cycle of poverty, she didn't have a roadmap to be a parent, and she didn't have an adequate support system. So as statistics would show, my brother and I ended up in the foster care system. I was a toddler and he was a baby, and we were bounced around home to home. Oftentimes we were separated. Sometimes we were together. Sometimes we were not. Ultimately, my brother and I were adopted separately from a children's home when I was 12 years old, because by that time, it was very evident that my brother and I had vastly different needs. And it was actually my CASA that made that really difficult choice to allow for us to be adopted in separate homes. And so I'm very grateful for the CASA program that you got to hear a little bit about. Here in Florida, CASAs are called, where I live in Florida, spoiler alert. I mentioned that earlier with the hurricane situation, which PS, I had a friend, legitimately, the hurricane blew an alligator into her backyard. I'm not even kidding. I put it on my Facebook page. Like, you would think I'm making it up, but no, legit. So I'm like, oh, roof damage, oh, appliances, all this stuff we lost. But I was like, oh no, you win, because you woke up to a gator in your backyard. But I digress. So you're going to learn that about me. And unfortunately, in this kind of forum, I have nobody in an audience that's like reeling it back in. So you're just going to have to bear with me. But I'm sure somebody has a kid that's got a little ADD in their class. So just jump on the wave, and it's going to be a good time. No one's going to judge you if you got a cocktail. This is going to be a casual session. So not to worry. Anywho, so I come from these circumstances that did not necessarily set me up for success. When I was 12 years old, I was adopted from a children's home, and my adoptive parents were lovely people, but we had a ton of struggles. There's an entire chapter in my first book called Testing, where I push every button these people had. I was not the most loving or easy to get along with, but it was so difficult for me to believe in this concept of happily ever after, because even with my adoption, I had seen kids be unadopted and sent back. Like that's actually a thing. You can return kids like an outfit that doesn't fit. And so I had seen this happen. And frankly, these adoptive parents, let's be honest, it was like a little too good to be true. Coming from a home that had 16 foster kids sharing 2 bedrooms in a trailer where we were beaten, starved, locked outside, forced to swallow hot sauce, it was absolutely this house of horrors. And so coming from circumstances like that into a home where there weren't locks on the cabinets or refrigerators, and I had this father figure who didn't yell and didn't hurt my mom, and I was like, okay, when's the shoe gonna drop? This doesn't feel like something that is even real or that I even deserve. And so one of the questions is, what made you tell your story? Well, a lot of it was because I knew that what was happening in these foster homes was wrong. And so from a very early age, I felt like I needed to say something and do something. And the education system became such a sanctuary for me, because when I went to school, I wasn't beaten and I didn't go hungry. I got the free breakfast and the free lunch. And that was just like, ooh, was I dining large? And I usually got even more attention because once my teachers learned I was a foster kid, I think there's so many preconceived notions about who foster kids are and what we can achieve, or the expectations of us. And admittedly, there were lots of other kids that would flip over desks or, raise havoc. But I think once they learned my situation, they were so impressed that I could get through a full school day without property damage. And it was just amazing to get their encouragement. And admittedly, I did get this sense of satisfaction. And I think that was part of my coping mechanism, was like when I would be bullied or made fun of, or, my clothes were terrible or had holes in them or didn't fit. I would be like, oh, well, what did you get on that math test? That was just sort of a source of pride for me. And it was amazing to be in that circumstance because, as my intro said, my education was something that I learned really young. It was something I was going to have for the rest of my life. It was something nobody could control, nobody could take away. And it was remarkable to just have that little bit of kindness in my day, to have a meal, to have that safety and that security. And that's a really big reason that I'm such a big fan of the movement that's happening nationally to bring more awareness about trauma-informed classrooms, because there are techniques and there are opportunities for schools to be even more of those safe havens for children. And aside from my CASA being such a tremendous impact, because she took on our case and she was a volunteer who came into my foster homes. And when they were questionable foster homes, she was like, no, I don't think so. Something is amiss here. But she was also the person who made sure that I was getting my teeth cleaned and my hair cut, and that I had a poster board for my science fair project. And systemically, you would think that there are a lot of other people who are supposed to be handling some of these things. But here is this woman who was just a volunteer in the community, who had a little bit of time and a really big heart. And she was helping to fill some of those gaps. And that made a tremendous difference in my case legally, because she was the one that helped me become freed for adoption in the first place. She recognized that permanency and community and a support system were critical to a child's survival. And that's what she wanted to make sure that I had. But in the 4th grade, I had a teacher who gave me my very first book. Now, this was a book that was like my own book. And it was Anne of Green Gables. So I read this book, and of course I knew about, Little Orphan Annie, but I was like, okay, I'm thumbing through this thing, and I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. What's up with all of these orphans who have red hair and their names start with the letter A? I was sensing a little bit of a pattern here, but that book was sort of this new way to process the world around me. So I started journaling and I started reading, and literature became this wonderful escape. I would love to see a digital show of hands of where my readers are. Being educators and such, I hope that there's, come on, friends. I know more of you you have books stacked up on your nightstand. You are educators. Don't even tell me different. This is not Marie Kondo talking to you. I endorse having copious amounts of books just piled all over your house and in your lives. But truly, that was a really wonderful aha moment for me. And some of those little tiny things that perhaps the teachers themselves don't even remember, perhaps they don't know the impact that they made. But here was this little book. And what ultimately happened from this little book? Well, this became a wonderful outlet for me to channel my frustrations and that solidify that love of school. So I knew that I wanted to go to college. That was a major hope of mine. And because I had been adopted so late, I also recognized that I didn't have a big college fund set aside for me. This was something that I was going to have to figure out. And I started, oh, I love this, not an educator, but tons of books. You are in the right place. But college was something that I knew I wanted to do. So when I was in high school, I started applying for every scholarship I could, every writing contest, everything. And back to the advocacy question, what made me share my story? Well, when I was younger, I felt like I had to share my story because I was speaking out on behalf of the other kids. I was going to school, going to my sanctuary, telling my teachers and adults and anyone that would listen to me, I was telling them what was going on in that home. And fortunately, almost all of you on the screen are mandated reporters. So my schools were a lot of the places where some of those abuse calls were triggered and these foster parents were investigated. Ultimately, that home that I described as that was kind of not great, they ultimately were arrested on over 42 counts of felony child abuse with torture. And so those calls made a difference. It didn't help immediately. What ended up happening was when the investigations occurred, I was branded a liar and a troublemaker. So I was removed from the foster homes for causing too much trouble, so for advocating and speaking out. But ultimately, there was enough evidence that somebody was listening to the children. Somebody was speaking up, somebody was saying something. And so that desire to advocate for others was instilled in me very young. And I love school, I love learning. So I started sharing my story yet again when I was trying to get different scholarships and opportunities. And again, writing and reading was just a way that I processed the world and experiences even to this day. So I did my first big essay contest when I was 14. And the essay was put on by USA Today, and they asked you to write an essay entitled How Harry Potter Books Changed My Life. And so I want no judgment because I see this beautiful screen of people, and I know there are some Potterheads in this little breakdown. So no judgment here. This is a safe space. But I did this essay contest, and I remembered that book and like sharing my story, and I was going to be like Little Orphan Ashley, and really like just put myself out there and see what happens. And I happened to be one of 10 winners for this contest, but the prize was that I got to fly to New York and have breakfast with J.K. Rowling. So that was I mean, that was huge. That was so exciting. And she was so gracious, so lovely. She talked about her story and her experience, and she didn't have the easiest upbringing or circumstances either. And so, I mean, talk about just like a major mentor moment, like give me a break. That was that was amazing. And that really gave me a lot of encouragement to go on and do my next essay contest, which was when I was a teenager, just beyond that. And this one was for the New York Times Magazine. And they asked you to write about a day that was really life changing. So I wrote about my adoption day, but I wrote about how my adoption was not this rainbows and sunshine kind of occasion. It was absolutely terrifying. Again, it was too good to be true. I mean, who am I? I'm just this like, I don't know. What if I'm unadopted? You know, did my hair twirling? Oh gosh, it was just really uncomfortable. So my essay was called Three Little Words, and that's sort of how a lot of what I'm doing now started. I happened to win first prize with that essay contest. Yes. And the essay was published in the New York Times Magazine. And from that, publishers contacted me interested in hearing my full story. So here I was, I think 16 or 17, with this prospect of writing a book. And I mean, I had no idea what I was doing. The whole concept was completely terrifying. But when something really cool like that happens, you gotta say yes, and you figure it out later. And that was, let's see, my first book came out in 2008, just after I graduated from college. And I never even thought that I would make it to college. And that's what that community did. So going back, thinking about how did I get here? What were those steps? I think about all of those small acts of kindness. You know, here's this teacher who gave me a book that inspired this creative outlet for my pain. And it ultimately turned into me writing my own book. I mean, it never, that never would have occurred to me. And I just think that was so powerful. And at the time, I definitely did not understand the impact that a personal story can have. And I also recognize that as people who put themselves out there for others, you sometimes don't know what happens to your students or your CASA cases, your guardian cases. But I hope that my story is a reminder of how amazing each of you are and how your efforts are noticed, and they very well could be life-changing. I want to go back and check some of the texts right now, or the chat comments. Do teachers that share the book find long-term improvement in their treatment toward foster kids so do teachers that share the book, do you find, let's see, find long-term improvement in their treatment? When I wrote the book, I guess I would, by all means, other teachers, feel free to answer part of that question as well if you find the book useful or meaningful. I know the first book does have a reader guide that Simon & Schuster put out. So there's like discussion guides, and it is meant, it's published under the young adult division of Simon & Schuster. So it is meant to be shared with teenagers and young people. And even though the subject matter can feel really heavy, it's real life. I think it's human nature for adults to want to protect kids and shield them from having to age even an hour more quickly than necessary. But kids, especially now, they are growing up in a world where they are inundated with information. And it would have been, even back then, so helpful for me to know what was going on so that I didn't build these fantasies in my head. I didn't have to fill in these blanks with guesses. And I really believe there's always an age appropriate way to explain to a child what's going on in their lives. a lot of my adverse childhood experiences are exactly what inspired me to become a social worker. So I got to go to college and I went on to get a master's degree in social work. And I'm now a clinical social worker, and I have a little small agency that I run in my own community, providing direct services to children and families in high risk and high conflict situations. And I see every day kids who just need someone to believe in them, who need a way to understand their circumstances in a different light. And I'm so grateful that I got to have basic experiences like having a family. And because I had that permanency, because I had that family, because I had that support system, when I was in high school, I got to get a yearbook. And I know that sounds silly, but like I was in the yearbook. So I was in the same school when they took the picture, and then still at that same school at the end of the year when the books came out. Like that doesn't always happen. That was really a big deal. And having adoptive parents meant that I got to get a driver's license and terrify my father on the road. And it meant that I got to go to prom and also terrify my father. But it meant that I got to go to college. Across the country, 50% or less of foster children will graduate high school. 3% or less go on to higher education. Those numbers alone show you how critical it is to embrace these children who have experienced trauma and adversity, embrace them in different ways, and just understand a little bit more about the behavior they're communicating, because it may feel like sometimes they're just making your life completely miserable, but often there's a why. And there's a reason some of these behaviors. Behavior is just another form of communication, especially for kids. When they don't have the words, they express it with their bodies. And that's going to manifest in a lot of different ways. But that permanency and that consistency allows for those changes to take place in a child's life that will be with them forever. So the crazy thing about me going to college, not only was that just like a big deal in itself, when my dorms closed, I had a family to go home to. I had parents that showed up on Parents' Weekend. I had a place to go when the campus was closed for Christmas and spring break and Thanksgiving and summer and Christmas and Hanukkah, because my adoptive mom is Jewish. So we get to do both. Except my very first Hanukkah, legitimately the biggest ripoff of my life. Like, I get that she's just trying to ease me into the traditions and kind of teach me about the whole thing. I kid you not. She gave me one sock one night and then the matching sock the next night. And then as the nights go on, the gifts are supposed to get progressively more impressive. So then I would get a pajama set with the top one night and the bottoms the next night. And I'm like, what's up with this Hanukkah stuff? Oy vey. But as a kid, and probably as is the case with the young people that you are working with, that you are serving, that you have in your classroom, I did not have the capacity to conceptualize the importance of having caring, consistent adults in my life. I didn't get that. I couldn't see that far in advance. I was too terrified, wondering if I would go to bed in the same place that I went to sleep the night before. Would I even have a bed at all? What school was I going to? Where would I get my next meal? Would these people remember my birthday? You know, it was total survival mode. And now I understand the importance of having a volunteer who wanted to get a kid out of a dangerous situation in foster care. I understand what it means to have the importance of a community and family and people to love you unconditionally. Because I had a CASA who put her neck out there for me, I was able to have that stability of an adoptive family. And because of that adoptive family, I had a father to walk me down the aisle when I got married. I had a mother to hold my hand in the delivery room when we gave birth to our first child. And by we, I mean me. I'm taking full credit for that one. I feel like I'm still paying for it in one form or another. And now I'm living a life that I did not think would be possible. And I'm today a clinical social worker and a mother. And I have, well, my husband and I were foster parents for many years. I'm a big fan of practicing what you preach. So I don't think it's enough to just complain about something if you're not willing to be an active part of the solution. So I wanted to be one of those foster parents that made a difference. When I graduated from college, I became a CASA as well. And then after I was married, my husband and I were foster parents, and we cared for over 25 children. And our eldest child is adopted from the foster care system. So now I am a mom of 3 kiddos who are 6, recently 8, and also 8, because we have, you know, what do they say? A brother from another mother. So that's kind of what we have in our situation. My son is the brother from another mother, our middle son. So, I mean, here I am with you. And this was not necessarily going to be my fate or be my outcome. And so I have so much thanking to do. I thank Mary Miller, my CASA volunteer. I thank my adopted parents, but I also thank the educators and the people who reported abuse, who bestowed acts of kindness, who understood when I was having a really rough day in the classroom, who took a bigger approach to my care than they really had to. And those small acts of kindness ultimately created this tremendous ripple effect in my life that has led to all of this. And I'm so grateful. And I'm trying to feel the private messages that I'm getting in as well. This one is about thoughts and advice to provide to the school board or those regarding supports and services that are offered. So I live in Florida. I would love for Jacob or Sean to field some of these or type them in the chat box. This is also something that is often, it seems obvious, but it's so surprising how there is not necessarily a consistent vehicle for communication amongst organizations in a community, and certainly not nationally. So if you are someone who knows of an incredible resource that addresses, let's say, something that supports educators or CASAs or volunteers to help deal with burnout, having resources on, as I'm seeing in the trauma-informed instruction, is absolutely critical. And that's a wonderful movement that's happening. Everyone should be trauma informed. And for educators, there are specific avenues for trainings and information on how to have a trauma informed classroom, how to have that perspective. Like, there's a whole reading guide I was looking at earlier from let's see, NCTSN, which I always forget the acronyms, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. I'll put this in the chat box so you have that. But there are just organizations all over. And if Jacob has regionally specific opportunities or trainings, please, any of you, post in the chat, because so much of this has to be communication and the sharing of resources and making sure that we are connecting. And sometimes these trainings can feel very elementary, like, oh yeah, I know that. But, okay, well, I'm trying to put it in the main chat, but it's not letting me, everyone. Look at me. So please, even if you think it's like so silly, put books in the chat that you're enjoying. Talk about attachment. Talk about the resources that you use. What books are you really into? Do you have a support group? Is there a Facebook group that you're a part of that seems to be really helpful? it's remarkable the resources I find, just like browsing someone's information on Facebook. It's just absolutely remarkable. So as I continue to just blabber on, feel free to put in that link, relationships, relationships, relationships. Absolutely. That is one of the key pillars of having that trauma informed classroom. And it's that power of one person. Resiliency was something that I took really seriously. And especially in grad school, I was like, why am I here while my brother is struggling so much? Why did my mom, what happened? And the key to resiliency is that power of one person. People are not born predisposed to be more resilient than another. It's about the influences that they've had in their life and the consistent support that they're able to maintain. And that's what you are providing for young people every day. So please never underestimate the importance of that. Do I stay in touch with my biological mom? The answer is yes. So my mom later had another daughter. We are about 15 years apart, but my sister is a junior in college and is thriving beautifully. And it took my mom a really long time to figure out a flow. And now that I'm a mother myself, I much more intimately understand the struggles that she encountered. And she had another infant son who died. So here is a young woman who has two children who have passed away. She has not had many chances or many breaks or many people to extend a helping hand to her. In fact, when she became more comfortable sharing elements of her history and past, which are very painful for her to relive, she said that here she was, this teenager who had had her children removed because her boyfriend at the time had been arrested. And apparently the first caseworker on our case said, well, if you sleep with me, you can have your children back. So that was her introduction to this system of care that's supposed to help her better herself. That wasn't something that she really, it was scary and it was traumatizing. And so it took her a really long time to figure out how to be a stable adult, but she was able to do it. And again, my sister is doing beautifully. And as a general rule of thumb, I am always happy to have people in my life who are sober, who are healthy. And that's part of the healing work that I've done in my adult life, is setting safe boundaries. And it was much easier for me to do that again when I had children, because I'm a little bit of a mama bear. So I don't mess around when it comes to my kids. And I want to make sure that the people in their life, regardless of DNA, because to me, DNA is not family. Family is comprised of people who support you unconditionally, who raise you up, who have a positive reciprocal relationship. And so I welcome, I love this. We have the adverse childhood experiences instructor. I hope everyone knows about the ACEs. That is like a must. So yes, again, I do have contact with my mom, and I have lots of contact with other members of my biological family. And I think it's so important for kids to know their roots and know where they come from. But it's equally important for kids to know that they don't owe anything to anyone. And it doesn't matter who the person is, whether it's a mother, father, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, cousin, whatever. Nobody has the right to hurt them or manipulate them or take advantage of them or do anything that is going to bring harm to their lives. And that is really, really challenging. I love that spontaneously many of you are talking about the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So the adverse childhood experiences are, I think it was created, I don't remember the date, but it's basically the golden standard for evaluating and understanding trauma and abuse. So it is comprised of 10 very specific questions that are, they're yes or no questions. And I don't have them all memorized, even though I use this tool like daily, but it's things like, have you ever been a victim of domestic violence, or have you witnessed domestic violence? Have you ever not had enough to eat? Have your parents been divorced? Do you know someone, or has a family member been incarcerated or arrested? So it's kind of those questions that are representative of elements of traumatic experiences that children may have encountered. And so you answer yes or no. And essentially, the more yeses you have, the more services you might need in adult life. ACEs are connected. Like the higher the ACE score, the higher mortality rate, the higher instances of cardiovascular disease, of mental illness, of poorer outcomes in general. And so the ACEs are a really interesting framework to understand the services and the needs a young person might have. So I joke about it because I think joking and laughing is sort of my coping mechanism of choice. But I have a 10. So my ACEs score is a 10 because I'm an overachiever. But the ACEs are not a test that you want to necessarily ace. But so, yeah, I think the national average is 2 or 3. And by 4, if you have 4 of these factors, like, oh boy, you're probably going to need a lot of therapy. That's when a lot of organizations get big grants, because they're like, oh man, if you got a 4, these are some kids that are going to need some work and need some support. So I have a 10, which suddenly makes the audience a little bit nervous when they hear that. But my husband has a 0. So we joke that he married a 10 and I married a 0. But the implications of that are really substantial, because kids who have really high, or people who have high ACEs scores, they struggle in relationships. They struggle with employment. We talked about some of the educational and academic statistics of kids in care, but unbelievable percentages of kids who come from untraditional families in terms of abuse, poverty. So many of my former foster brothers and sisters have become teen parents. They have been in abusive relationships. They've experienced homelessness, joblessness, drug abuse, constant revolving doors of incarceration. My own brother had at least or almost 1 felony arrest nearly every single year since he turned 17 until he died. And he overdosed 3 days after his most recent incarceration. So the ACEs really allow for a window into the needs of kids, or allow you just to better understand how and why kids process things the way that they do. And I'm trying to figure out how to scroll back up in the little chat function. I, I was talking to Jacob in the sound check, and my 8-year-old is learning all of this really amazing technology, as all of you are as well. And he's like, don't worry, mommy, if you have a Google Drive account, I can help you figure out how to do the Google slides and the presentation. I'm like, so my 8-year-old is like slaying it in, in all of this. But it looks like there's really fabulous resources that are taking place and being disseminated in the chat function. For some reason, I can't seem to scroll back up to some of the previous questions, but I would love to use, I know we only have about 10 minutes together, so I would love to use the remaining time that we have to field questions that you may have. So one just popped in. Thank you for the merciful question. You and Luke got a letter from Dusty. Do you have any contact with Dusty? So Dusty is the biological father of my brother. And sadly, I think about a year after my brother passed away, Dusty also overdosed and died. So that was, I mean, it's just so indicative of that cycle. It's a cycle. It's multiple generations. And now there's so many interesting studies that talk about child abuse and the physical impacts of abuse being hereditary, and how that trauma can be passed down generation to generation. And so that was something that I was always very mindful of as I became a parent, because you can pass on that strife and that trauma. Um, so, I mean, that was obviously another devastating blow. But I think it's also important to use these as opportunities to learn and educate and figure out how to move forward to prevent these tragedies from happening to others. Has the foster care system changed? Well, there has been a lot of systemic change that has taken place since my time in care. And when I was 26, I ran for state senate because, well, I think, all right, let's be fully honest. So I was also pregnant at the time. I gave birth election week. I was in grad school, finishing grad. So I'm going to chalk this up to like pregnancy hormones and just like this burning desire to make a difference. But yes, lots of systemic change has occurred since my time in care. Unfortunately, all of the laws and changes and policies, they're only as good as the people who are implementing them. That's why it's so important to independently stay abreast of the changes that are taking place, because you are not only going to be the best advocate for the young people that you serve, but you have to be your own advocate in so many realms. And believe it or not, sometimes you'll know more than the experts. But I also think back to my story and how, yes, there's all of, now I'm like a conference junkie. I'm a total conference crasher back when, conferences were a thing. And so you can learn every textbook front to back. You can know the evidence-based practice. You can be so versed in all of this, but it's ultimately going to be those relationships that make the biggest difference and the biggest impact on the lives of kids. And so no matter how frustrating it can feel, or if you suffer from imposter syndrome and you're like, oh, well, I'm not making a difference, or I don't know enough, just remember that no matter how much change occurs at any systemic level, it's going to be that one-to-one interaction that ultimately has the opportunity to make the biggest impact on a child's ability to be resilient despite their circumstances. And that was a big reason that when we transitioned from foster parenting, I went into direct service, because I was really determined to equip kids with the tools that they need to transcend any environment and any circumstance they find themselves in. And that's really, I think, one of the most powerful opportunities is when we can create these little survivors and these kids who will go on to achieve wonderful things and be productive members of society, because they had someone who told them that they can, and that is possible, and that is enough. And just that is tremendous. How do I feel about biological family members being chosen to be adoptive families over foster families that the child has a strong bond with? So I think that is one of those issues that is popping up. And that is exactly why there is no cookie cutter way to deal with child welfare. There is no one size fits all. For instance, nationally and in general, it's best to try to keep siblings together, keep families together. But in my case, that was not safe. That was not in our best interest. And I had a CASA volunteer who was able to say just that. And that was a very possibly life-changing call that took place, because my adoptive parents are, and they're probably going to strangle me for saying this, but they're nearing their 80s. And so they were much older when they became adoptive parents, and it was a totally different lifestyle, a totally different skill set. And they were able to help me, again, go to college and achieve these things. And my brother was initially matched with a family that was young, and they went camping and hiking, and their lifestyle was much more conducive to a really active kid that my brother was. But he struggled so significantly, and the whole family didn't have those post-adoptive services and that community engagement that I think is such an incredibly important piece to allowing families to stay together. And do I have regular contact with child protection workers. So I had lots of workers. In the back of my first book, I have a list of some of the professionals that I found in my case files, and there were over 200 officials that had a hand in my case. And so I had a lot of turnover in my caseload. I want to check with Jacob. It's 9 o'clock, so I'm kind of nearing my hour. Do we have time to kind of go on, or should I plan to be wrapping it up?
Absolutely. If you want to continue for a few more minutes, maybe we can wrap it up in about 10 minutes, because it seems like there's a few more questions coming in about, do you have any new books that are coming out? Yeah, there's several other questions.
Okay. Well, I won't be offended. I know it's 9. Oh, it's not 9 your time. It's 9 my time. But if people need to go off and eat dinner, I'm not going to be offended. So you do you. Thank you for coming. Enjoy your child-free, hurricane leak-free home. But yes, so biological. So that really speaks to, I think, how important it is to have an individualized approach to each kid. We are not package deals. Every kid has different needs. Every kid has differing learning plans. So I really appreciate organizations like CASA. And I think Sean sold it a little bit short in some respects. I mean, CASAs are the people who are the only adult in that courtroom, in that space, who is there exclusively to speak on behalf of the child and the child's best needs. They are the eyes and the ears for the court. They don't have another hidden agenda. They don't have someone who is dictating the calls they should make. They are there to simply give the realities and give voice to these young people. It's a major, major role. And so having people like that who are able to say the things that others can't, and blow a whistle when necessary, and be someone like Mary Miller, who doesn't take no for an answer. And, sometimes CASA are the people who make the call that's unpopular, but it's the right thing to do. And so that's always been so powerful about the relationship. And I'm still in touch with my CASA to this day. We actually just had a picnic, socially distanced picnic, in celebration of one of our kiddos' birthdays. So we are still in touch. I just saw the question, do you stay in touch with Mandy or any of the other foster kids? That goes back to my boundaries question. And so a lot of these kids have struggled tremendously. And so I welcome relationships in my life that are healthy, and people that are, stable and could be people that I get introduced to my children. So there are so many of my former foster brothers and sisters, again, who are incarcerated, who are experiencing a lot of different struggles. So I don't have a ton of contact with them, but I think it's also, it's very close and it's hard, and I think it's triggering, and all survivors of abuse of any kind or adversity of any kind process their lives in different ways. And so I've been able to make a lot of wonderful connections with former foster youth, but I think sometimes those relationships are a little bit easier to forge because it's not quite so close to home. It's very parallel and our stories are similar, but I think it's a very different dynamic and brings up a whole different set of emotions and issues when you shared a lived experience and perhaps your life didn't manifest in exactly the same way. I think that can be an additional source of hurt for some of them. So with the world being the way that it is now and the accessibility, there are foster youth connecting with each other, connecting with biological family. And so I'm really receptive to healthy relationships that come my way. But I'm sad to say that a lot of the young people that I knew and that I grew up with have not fared as well as I have. And that's another big reason that I am very quick to express my gratitude when I have opportunities like this to do so. Do you stay in touch, Casas? Casas can be, establishing trust. I think trust is really wonderful. And I know that we don't have time to jump into like a whole training, but definitely strong connections are unbelievably vital. Those small acts of kindness are making a big difference, even if you think that they're not. If a child feels like they can be themselves in your classroom or in your presence, that is going to go a long way in helping them feel safe, helping them feel heard, helping them feel validated, and not be ashamed of who they are and where they've come from, because there's so much shame and so much heaviness that is associated with, again, poverty, child abuse. But you have the opportunity to create these safe spaces in classrooms, but also just in your presence, that will allow for some of that healing to take place. And this might be a moment where for 5 seconds we're not made fun of, but most importantly is that element of control. When we feel like we have control over our lives or a situation or an outcome, that can really go a long way into helping a child feel safe. And I see the numbers dwindling, so I'm going to take that as a sign that everybody's ready to wrap up this show. See, what kind of relationships did you have with the workers? So again, in my story, a lot of the workers, there was tremendous turnover. And so I wasn't really able to forge a lot of relationships with some of the state workers because they were changing so frequently. My CASA happened to be that, and this is, I swear this is not just like a huge plug for CASA. I can only tell the story I experienced. But, my CASA was someone who just happened to be a consistent part of my life from the time I was 7 years old through my adoption. And now I turned 35 this month, but my CASA to this day is still a part of my life and my children. So, I just put this together in my brain. So I met Mary when I was 7, and now my children are 6, just turned 8 and 8. So my kids have a Miss Mary Miller in their life at the same age that I was when Mary came into my life. So there's something really poetic and super special about that. And yes, I want to thank all of you for this opportunity to share, and certainly for all the things that you do in your communities. And I'm a real life person. I'm very slow when it comes to social media and learning technology, but I would love, go Gators, go Gators. Uh-oh, are we going to get in trouble? I don't know. Are you in big football areas? Well, I think the big to do now is the Tampa Bay Bucks. We have Tom Brady now. So like that's the big hubbub in Tampa Bay. Oh, that, and I don't know, the Stanley Cup and the World Series, and just a little humble brag there for the Tampa Bay sports teams. No big deal. But truly, reach out to me if I can ever be of help. And being in the clinical social work space, if I can ever provide resources or help direct you to various trainings or things that will help strengthen your classrooms, or absolutely anything, I would love to support the work that you do, because the work that you're doing is allowing young people like me to thrive and survive. So thank you endlessly for that.
Thank you, Ashley. We really appreciate it and hope to see you face to face soon in Northwest Montana and be able to share your story face to face. And thanks everyone for being part of this. The teachers that are part of the Troy School District, Libby and Eureka, I will be sending out the renewal units to your superintendents. In Troy, I'll be sending it directly to you. And anyone else, please just email me personally and I will send you those renewal units as an educator. So thank you again, Ashley. And thanks again, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.